Welcome everybody to the post Surfside update and Florida bar recommendations for legislative changes related to Surfside. One thing Diego forgot to mention is everyone's camera and microphone are automatically disabled, so we cannot see or hear any of you, nor can anyone else on this call. So let me start with some introductions. My name is Evan Bradley. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for Campbell Property Management and one of the 5 owners of the company. I'm a licensed CAM, and I work very closely with some of our largest clients on the major issues facing their associations. For those of you not as familiar with Campbell, we've been in business since 1953. We manage over 400 HOA and condominium association clients from Dade to St. Lucie counties here in South Florida. Our legal expert with us today is Lisa Magill. She's an excellent condo and HOA attorney we've had the privilege of working with for many years. Lisa's an attorney with the firm Kaye, Rembaum, one of Florida's leading firms specializing in the field of community association law. And Lisa's also been heavily involved up in Tallahassee. Also with us today is Evan Swaysland from Swaysland Professional Engineering, who will give us some engineering insight and property maintenance insight. So first, Lisa, would you like to say a little bit about yourself and your firm? You're muted, Lisa.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be able to participate today. Very, very important subject, talking about building maintenance obligations, reserves, and what have you. As you indicated, I'm an attorney that practices in this area, board certified by the Florida Bar in Condominium and Planned Unit Development Law, as are many of our other attorneys at Cape Rembaum. I'm also a fellow of the College of Community Association Lawyers, which is a nationwide recognition issued by the Community Associations Institute. Our firm, we have offices throughout the state, represent community associations all over the state, offices in Palm Beach County, Broward County, and Hillsborough County. We, as I indicated, many of our attorneys are board certified in condominium and planned unit development law, and we are happy to work with Campbell Property Management with respect to this and any of its other educational endeavors. So thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. And also with us is Evan Swaysland of Swaysland Engineering. Evan, would you like to say a little about yourself and your firm?
Yeah, hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Evan Swaysland. I'm the Vice President of Swaysland Professional Engineering Consultants. I'm one of the owners here. We are founded since 1990. We've been in business for over, 32 years now, or just at 32 years, performing engineering services in the South Florida area, as far south as Key West, up to, right now up to Martin County. Our main niche engineering has always been doing concrete restoration and restoration of existing structures, and in our weather environment, this is a prime location for that. Me personally, I'm the former president of the International Concrete Repair Institute, which is a governing body that gives recommendations on how to appropriately make concrete repairs and maintain structures. So we're very active in the industry down here and can provide some insight here in today's webinar.
Thanks a lot, Evan. Just a reminder, this is for informational purposes only, and it's not legal or engineering advice. If you have questions about your specific community, please reach out to your association's attorney or your professional engineer. We do encourage everyone to take advantage of the Q&A today, but please try to limit it to questions about the course material, questions about your individual legal or mechanical or engineering situation. We just can't get into everyone's personal situation today, so we hope you understand. All right, so getting into the agenda, we're going to give everyone an update on Surfside, Champlain Towers, and what people think happened at this time, some new legislation that's already been enacted in some municipalities, what the Florida Bar recommendations are at the state level, what the Broward County recommendations are at the state level, briefly discuss what we anticipate might happen, and then we'll talk with Evan quite a bit about what you should be looking for and what you can be doing now, regardless of any legislation. And then whatever time we have left, we'll try to do some open Q&A through the Q&A feature. So first, we'll talk a little bit about Surfside. So it was actually Champlain Towers South condominium that collapsed. We all remember this was a terrible tragedy. 98 people were confirmed killed, and our thoughts and prayers still go out to those people. There's many people that are still obviously being affected by this. It was a 136 unit, 12-story tower. It was built in 1981, so it was actually not quite 40 years old at the time of the collapse, and 55 units were destroyed. So the Miami Herald has actually done a really great piece of journalism on this. People who are really interested, I do encourage you to take down this link or Google the article. It's a long read. The article itself is probably a 30 or 40-minute read, but it really gets into a lot of detail. They've interviewed engineers, architects, eyewitnesses. They've used computer modeling, simulations to try to piece together what they think exactly happened. It's important to point out it is still too early to know exactly what happened. The National Institute for Standards and Technology, that's actually a federal agency, is still investigating and will file a formal report, but that may not be released for another year or more. They're going to be extremely thorough in their investigation, and that will be the final report on this. But getting back into the Miami Herald article, they did identify two primary areas that were responsible for the collapse. There were some serious issues with the initial design and construction. It was substandard. It was not code compliant. Corners were cut, particularly with some of the reinforcing elements. And even with those initial problems, the building, still held for over 30 years. And an engineering report was done in 2018 that identified a lot of the issues and potential fixes, but it carried a over $9 million estimated price tag, and that prevented the board and the owners from moving forward as quickly as obviously they maybe should have. So what are the design and construction defects that they identified? First off, the original architect and structural engineer had a history recording of cutting corners and had serious blemishes on their resume. The architect actually had their license suspended for gross incompetence for a billboard that failed during a storm that they designed. And the structural engineer oversaw a parking garage project that started failing nearly the same day it was finished being built. So they were already off to a bad start. In terms of construction, there was inadequate support columns used. Some of the columns in the construction, the columns used under the side of the building that did not collapse, were much larger. They were 24 inches by 24 inches. The other columns that were underneath the part of the building that did collapse were only half that size, and that was a code violation at the time the building was built. There was not enough rebar used, so only a fraction of the required rebar that was in the approved design that rebar is used to tie the concrete columns into the concrete slab was actually used in construction. This was another code violation, even at the time. So before the building was even finished, there were serious deficiencies in the way it was built, but the building was still certified. What were some of the maintenance and restoration issues? Well, because of the inadequate size of the columns and the insufficient rebar, the slab above the pool deck was sagging and consistently holding ponding water. And then as they added additional tile and water into the planters and landscaping and things onto that deck, it caused it to sag even more, creating more standing water, more water intrusion, etc. The planters they had on that deck were leaking and had large palm trees with large root systems that were creating additional cracks, damage, and more avenues for water intrusion to get between the slab and the columns and down into the garage. So all of this water intrusion into the slab and garage caused very serious damage to what was already an insufficient support structure just based on construction. This was all identified in a 2018 engineering report. But again, the $9 million price tag created issues between the unit owners, the board, and the board actually did start to pass an assessment and have a plan in place, and that occurred in 2021, but it was obviously a little too late. So some of you on the call may be understandably concerned. How was this building certified safe for occupancy when there were code violations? But fortunately, there have been some major changes since Champlain Towers was built in 1981, the threshold building inspection requirement and the 40-year inspection requirement. So there was actually a collapse of an under construction building in 1981, the same year Champlain Towers was built, and that resulted in this threshold inspection law. So this is Evan's area of expertise. Evan, can you help us understand what a threshold inspection is?
Yeah, so a threshold building, that's defined by the Florida building codes. That's any building which is greater than 3 stories or 50 feet in height from the ground, or can have an occupancy classification which exceeds 5,000 square feet in area and an occupant content greater than 500 persons. So that's what a threshold building is defined at. So per the code, any building, and this even relates to concrete repairs of buildings that size, that, you know, a building of that size being built, you need somebody that has this threshold inspection license in order to perform inspections, basically as a surrogate for the building department. And in order to have that license, currently you need to be a structural engineer with 5 years of experience designing threshold buildings, or be a structural and licensed engineer that performs structural inspections that has passed specific classes that are from the Post-Tensioning Institute, the American Concrete Institute, the Masonry Institute, and the International Code Council. There's about 6 classes you would need to take, and then you submit all this paperwork showing that you have completed all this stuff to the Florida Board of Professional Engineers, and then you get this subsequent license. So it is a specialized license.
So it's safe to say it's a much stricter requirement to get a building certified post 81 now than it was prior.
Correct.
Okay. So then the other thing that's changed since then is the 40-year inspection process. So currently 40-year inspections occur in Broward and Dade counties only, although Palm Beach is discussing potential legislation to implement a 40-year inspection, and some municipalities do have it now. They're done at 40 years and every 10 years thereafter. There's only 2 components required to be inspected in the 40-year inspection in Broward and Dade. That's structural and electrical. And it does require an engineer or an architect, and they're primarily visual inspections. Evan, can you give us some more color on the 40-year inspection process?
Yeah, so originally this was Dade and Broward County only, and we'll get into that. There's a couple more municipalities that have now increased this. So, you know, when a building turned 40 years old, you got a notification from municipality, hey, you need to complete this 40-year recertification. There are standard forms in both Broward and Dade counties that basically give you the checklist of what you're supposed to inspect. And that's going to be basically the concrete framing system, the exterior walls, the roof, doors, windows, any wood truss framing, any steel framing. And then you basically would do this inspection by visual means. And then if you felt there was a need to perform any destructive testing, then you could go further. The point of the recertifications is not to bring your building up to current code. It is strictly to correct any life safety issues. And there's, as Evan said, there's an engineer, or there's a structural and electrical component, and it's important to make sure that the person doing the inspection is certified to do the work in either structural or electrical.
Thanks, Evan. So we do have some more information about 40-year inspections on our blog. That's readfan.org. If you go to readfan.org and search for 40-year certifications, there are some articles about that. So what is the new legislation that's already occurred? So as we mentioned, a couple municipalities, these happen to be in Palm Beach County, have added 40-year inspection requirements. Highland Beach now has one for buildings greater than 3 stories or 50 feet in height. Their certification is actually starting at 25 years and being done every 10 years thereafter until you get to 40 years. And then they're doing them every 7 years. Again, it's structural and electrical components, similar to what was discussed with Broward and Dade, and recommended repairs have to be completed in 1 year. So if your condominium is in Highland Beach and approaching 25 or greater than 25 years old, be on the lookout for that. Boca Raton has also added their own inspection requirement. Again, 3 stories or 50 feet in height, the threshold building definition that Evan referred to earlier. Certification begins at 30 years and is every 10 years thereafter. And those of you that live in Aventura, in Dade County, Aventura already had the 40-year inspection requirement because of being in Dade, but now they've required any engineering report that's prepared for a building with more than 4 units. It has to be turned into the city within 48 hours of receipt by either the board or the property manager. So important to know if you're in Aventura. All right, so now Lisa's going to help us a little bit. So Lisa was part of the team that made recommendations to the state from the Florida Bar. So Lisa, this is legislation that's pending. These are recommendations. So again, this has not happened yet, but Lisa, what has the Florida Bar recommended to the state in terms of statewide requirements for reserves and some of these other items?
Well, let me remind you, what happened in Surfside Towers was an anomaly. It's not something that anyone should absolutely fear, although, of course, you have to maintain and repair your buildings and improvements in a reasonable way in order to ensure that they meet their life's expectations. I actually didn't serve on the task force that was appointed by the Florida Bar, but as I'm sure as you can imagine, there's no shortage of studies that occurred after this horrible tragedy. So the Florida Bar did appoint several folks to serve on a task force. There was also the CAI, Community Association Institute, appointed several task force. Broward County issued its own task force. The Florida Building Professionals, and most recently, and I think the most comprehensive report was just issued, and that's by the Miami-Dade grand jury. So you have different entities or persons investigating different aspects of what happened, in order to make recommendations on how to avert this type of a tragedy going forward. The Florida Bar report is basically divided into categories. There's a category for building inspections and building maintenance, a category for reserve studies and reserve funding, a category for board powers and duties, and a category with regard to requirements for developers, CAMs, and community association managers and governmental entities. So the first thing that the bar noted is that Florida law does not require associations to obtain a reserve study, a professional reserve study. And the law does, though, require for condos and co-ops that a board of directors adopt a budget that includes a fully funded reserve analysis. Well, how can you have a reserve analysis or reserve calculations unless you have good information in order to create those calculations? So one of the recommendations that the bar did issue is that reserve studies should be mandatory. Although in my opinion, I think that the bar's report conflates the engineering inspection report with a reserve study. A reserve study is really a planning tool. It's a budgetary planning tool. It's designed to let the building owner, building operator understand what projects are going to be expected within a particular lifestyle cycle so that you can fund or prepare for the funding for those projects. The engineering analysis, which I'm sure Evan will talk about or expand a little bit later, is a much more detailed analysis to determine the existing conditions and need for corrective repairs or design, corrective designs. So the Florida Bar recommendation that they do recommend that a reserve study be performed. A reserve study is designed to outline all the components that are maintained and repaired by the association, estimate the remaining useful life of those components, estimate the actual cost to repair or the deferred maintenance expense when it's necessary to repair or substantially replace, and then assess the funding for it. So these would be mandatory under the board's recommendation for buildings 3 stories or higher, and the bar is recommending that the preparers be limited to professional engineers or general contractors that have 10 years of experience in cost estimating. there is a whole category of reserve professionals that are accredited by various organizations, and there's a different level of expertise that would be necessary to conduct a reserve study than obviously to prepare an engineering analysis. Now, many engineers do prepare reserve studies as part of their practice, but I want the participants today to understand that there really is a very big distinction between the two. I've only seen one bill filed this year that would eliminate waivers, but the bar recommends that at least 50% of the funding be effectuated, and to only allow members to waive up to 50% of the funding, increasing the vote necessary to waive or reduce funding to 75% of the quorum, up from what is now the majority of the quorum. And in the event that it's not fully funded, or there is a vote to waive as permitted by the laws based upon the recommendations, that the board announce alternative funding mechanisms for any amounts that are not presently funded. What are those alternative funding mechanisms? Well, we already know what they are. They're either the ability to obtain loan financing or the ability to levy and collect the special assessment. Levying the special assessment is only one half of the equation. You have to have the ability to collect the special assessment. The Florida Bar also recommends, and this is something that's universally accepted by many of the groups that evaluated what happened, is to eliminate the ability of the developer to waive funding for the first 2 years. If you think about it, the first 2 years of building operations is going to be your most minimal reserve contributions anyway. The component should be at the beginning of their useful lives, which should be 10, 15, 20, 30 years out. And the bar does recommend limitations on the use of the reserves, where reserves collected for life safety issues would be held in straight line accounts, not pooled with other accounts, and only allow the members to vote to repurpose reserves if the repurposing is for casualty repairs, or payment of insurance premiums, and if you're paying or other emergency expenditures, and if you're paying insurance premiums, to have those reserves replenished within the same 12-month period. We can move on to the next. So separate and apart from the actual reserve schedules, reserve analysis, is timely maintenance. And I'm sure that you have the same experience as I, where you buy an appliance. I recently just bought a cooktop. It came with 38 pages of detailed procedures for use, troubleshooting, how to maintain, what cleaning products to use, how often the various components needed to be cleaned and maintained. Well, when you take over a huge complex of buildings and improvements, it doesn't come with an instruction manual. It doesn't come with anything that tells you on what schedules every work needs to be performed. So obviously the board would like the law to be far more specific as far as the board's obligations with respect to the maintenance of the improvements. Also recommends that there be the turnover inspection report that's now required by 718, I think it's 301 subsection 4, be expanded to include not only the existing condition of the improvements that are turned over along with the estimated useful life. So that would serve as basically a baseline reserve study, but for there to be developed at the time of construction and at the time of turnover, recommended maintenance protocols, so that the community association leaders have an idea as to what is expected in order to maintain the useful life and the function, the efficacy of the building systems and components. Now, in the Florida Bar recommendation, failure of the association, meaning the board of directors, to obtain the appropriate inspections or prepare the work that would be recommended by the inspections would create a cause of action for owners to force compliance with that. And of course, the Florida Bar also recommends that the reserve studies be updated on every 5 years, but as I mentioned, in my opinion, it somewhat conflates or fails to distinguish the differences between the reserve study and the and building inspection or engineering inspection. The recommendations don't speak to guidance for existing buildings, but does recommend for all building owners have an inspection performed by the end of 2024 to develop, or with the professional, develop protocols for building maintenance and milestones for improvements and replacements.
Thanks, Lisa. So in addition to the Florida Bar recommendations, Broward County had their own task force put together, and they've made some recommendations, and these recommendations are being made up to Tallahassee for statewide implementation. Some of those recommendations are that there be a statewide inspection program, starting with buildings that are 30 years old and every 10 years thereafter. They're actually looking for some material testing and geotechnical analysis, which is far beyond just a visual inspection that's currently required in Dade and Broward County. So that would increase the amount of inspection that needs to be done. Waterfront buildings were a particular concern. They wanted seawalls reviewed, reviews of tidal overtopping or tidal flooding and how that may be impacting waterfront buildings. Any reports obtained would be provided to all owners upon completion of the report, regardless whether they ask for it or not. You're gonna have to send it to everybody. And that any engineering report, regardless of when it's conducted, that identifies any life safety issue, be turned into a local government office immediately for the municipality where that condominium resides. And kind of consistent with the Florida Bar, they're also strengthening recommending a strengthening of the waiver of reserves. I think Broward County wanted a 75% vote of the whole membership, not just of a quorum, which is even higher than the Florida Bar. That concrete and structural restoration be a required reserve. It's actually not currently. That new reserve study is required every 36 months, so even more frequently than the Florida Bar. A copy of the reserve study be provided to all owners, again, automatically, not just upon request, and a copy of the reserve study be provided to all prospective purchasers, again, not on request, but as a mandatory item. The other recommendations are that adequate insurance be obtained, which is really a requirement now, if I'm not mistaken, but that all those insurance documents would have to be turned into the DBPR, I guess, where they'd be looking for deficiencies. That would be a new requirement and somewhat onerous, but it's in their recommendations. And all associations over 50 units or $100,000 annual budget will have to hire a licensed CAM. They want to strengthen the requirements for condominium board members to get certified, that board members must take the certification course every 2 years. Currently, if you are serving contiguous terms, that's, you know, you've been on the board and haven't come off, you don't have to retake the certification until you come off the board and then try to get back on. They want to add an hour to that certification course, making it 3 hours from the current 2. And one of those hours would be on building and maintenance requirements. So there's a lot there. All that being said, Lisa, what are you kind of hearing, or what do you expect are some of the things we might see when actual legislation gets passed in this upcoming term here this spring?
Look, there are a lot of proposals that have already been filed. Many of them focus on the inspection reports and building maintenance issues. So some of them create differentials for inspections, the amount of time for which inspections are required, depending on how close to the coastline they are. Some reports, most of the requirements are if it's within 1/2 of the mile from the coast or within a mile from the coast, that be the first inspection done in 30 years and every 5 years thereafter. Some of them have for over a 3-story building that it would be 30 years and every 10 years thereafter. But if they're closer to the coast, 20 years, and then the 7-year re-inspections. I've only seen one proposal though so far this year that would completely eliminate the ability to waive reserves. I personally don't believe that there's much impetus or tolerance for imposing an immediate reserve funding requirement. It would be a shock to the system, to many communities out there. There'd have to be a mechanism for people to ramp up to get close to that 50% or what have you. And really, I think the focus right now is ensuring that there's somebody, some independent person, an engineer, a person that's licensed and has the expertise to conduct this analysis, conducts an analysis so that you understand what building maintenance needs are required and in positions to have work performed within a certain period of time, plus disclosure to the existing owners, disclosure to new owners, and disclosure to lenders in the event of a transfer or sale.
Right. Yeah, I fully expect we're going to get, at a minimum, mandatory reserve studies and a little bit a higher threshold to approve waiver of reserves. But like you said, I think there's still going to be a mechanism for that. And I expect there to be more education requirements for CAMs and board members related to building maintenance. I think those are no-brainers. We'll see what happens with some of these other items. A statewide inspection is certainly on the table. That wouldn't surprise me either. Although, like you said, they may make it, they may adjust it to buildings within so close to the beach or something like that. We'll have to see. And there was a question, and I saw in the Q&A, yes, these recommendations are all for what are called threshold buildings. Again, 3 stories or 50 feet. These are not for 1 or 2 story condos. So just to point that out. So some people obviously are understandably very concerned post Champlain Towers. And regardless of what legislation may or may not be passed, there's certain things that you should be looking for now. If you have any concerns about your building, work with your building engineer, like Evan from Swaysland. You can go look at past projects. If you've never obtained a reserve study, you should get a professional reserve study so you understand your financial obligations going forward. If you have a reserve study, but it's now 3, 4, 5, and even 2 years old with the inflation that we've had recently, I'd seriously consider getting a new reserve study in 2022. If you don't have a preventative maintenance schedule, you should have one. Your management company or manager should be able to help you with that. And safety has got to be everybody's number one concern. You cannot put off a project that has a life safety implication. So just understand that. So Evan, help us with, what are some things that lay people can look at in their own building and kind of have an idea of where there might be a concern?
Yeah. So for, the normal person, one thing that you can do is just take a look around. And if you see, when you park, take a quick look, or out in your balcony or something like that, look for some cracks, not just hairline, but cracks that would be around 1/16 of an inch, something in that width. The other thing that would be pretty obvious is concrete spalling, and spalling is when the concrete actually breaks away from its larger member, and that's indicative of a corrosion problem with the building. Other things, if you see water intrusion, particularly in parking garages or underneath roof decks, and that can lead to some accelerated failure of the reinforcing. The other thing would be something called efflorescence, which would be basically mineral deposits. Typically, you would see those at the undersides of slabs. And then, on your balconies, one of the last things is typically the problems on balconies are at the floor surfaces. So if you see any, differential movement in your tile or something like that, that can be indicative of issues with the slab floor surface. So those are all things that you can look for just as a lay person.
Okay. So we had a lot of questions about engineering inspections and reports. So one of them was, when should you involve an engineer?
So when should you involve an engineer is basically if you see any of those things and you should get an engineer to provide you a professional opinion. Our typical work scope is to look at entire properties, not typically individual units. So normally this is working with an association, not individual unit owners. So your building was built and you get to live in it at year 0. And ever since year 0, it's starting to degrade. It's never going to get better over time. So, your first paint and restoration project is likely going to take place or should take place within 7 to 10 years of when the building is built. And then you're going to be on a continual repair and painting cycle as long as the building is standing, or we're not all taking canoes to and from our houses and jobs because we're all living underwater from sea level rise. So whatever point comes first, you're going to be doing this continual repair painting. And our normal mechanism for deterioration in our environment is chloride ingress into the concrete structure that causes corrosion. And we typically see a lot of the major effects of corrosion at approximately 20 to 30 years. But you need to start doing little things before you get to that major point to make that major point much less palatable, or much more palatable when you go to make those repairs. So in reality, year 7 to 10, that's your first project. Every 7 to 10 years after that, that's your next project. And you probably need to have interim inspections in between that, which kind of aligns itself with some of these reserve study fundings of having that every 3 to 5 years, something in lines of that. So that's realistically what you need to do. The main type of inspection that should be performed is a visual inspection, okay? And that's just having, a licensed engineer come out and look around. And you're going to be able to see, the majority of what's going on and being able to fix that with a visual inspection. Now, secondary to that would be something called, what we would call acoustic emission or tap sounding. And that's usually hitting your exposed surfaces with a hammer. Now, the main problem that we have with a lot of exterior condos is that everybody has a tile finish on their balconies, and that's very restrictive on what you can observe, what's going on in the slab. So one thing that we would strongly urge would be is that, at least perform some removal of tile in a cross section of units to be able to see the top surface of the slab. That can allow you to do some more advanced techniques such as corrosion monitoring, some strength testing of the concrete, things like that. So usually your third step would be to be some form of destructive testing, and then to do some further analysis. There are some non-destructive techniques that you can use to try to identify voids in the slabs and possibly some corrosion on rebar, although it's not really that effective. And that would be either ground penetrating radar or X-ray. Ground penetrating radar is much more economical than X-ray, although you don't get as good of results. X-ray is really not an economical approach to really look at large areas of the building. It's very time constrictive and is also fairly expensive. Ground penetrating radar is a little bit better technology, although you don't get really much more accurate results than if you just were able to do a visual inspection of the slabs. There's some other types of technologies such as pulse echo and some other things, and the International Concrete Repair Institute has some very good guidance on those different types of techniques. So if you're, interested in this and can stomach reading a technical document that, might take you an hour to get through, that can give you some more information and give you some good questions to ask the potential engineer that you might hire.
Thanks, Evan. So, and I think it's important to point out too, reserve studies are not engineering reports. So just because you have a reserve study does not mean an engineer has actually looked at your building And if you do have any concerns about structural or integrity, do hire an engineer. One of the popular questions is, how do we choose an engineering firm, and how do we know that they're a good firm, especially about this particular type of work?
That's the age-old question. Did I hire the right contractor? Did I hire the right engineer? Did I hire the right person? And one thing you can do is certainly, you know, if you're on this webinar, likely you have a management company. Your management company just doesn't manage your building, they manage a bunch of buildings. So, you know, they're going to have some knowledge of who to potentially interview and get proposals from in order to give you, you know, good feedback that way. The second thing is longevity. You know, we've been in business over 30 years. Our professional engineering staff has over 100 and some years of experience being professional engineers. And then one very important thing, as we touched on earlier, is that threshold inspection license. So that's a specific license you need to be able to perform inspections. And actually Highland Beach, for their recertification, actually wants you to have a threshold engineer do the inspections. And that just means that as a threshold engineer, you have more familiarity with this size of buildings and their design and their construction. You know, it's not just somebody that has a PE, it's a little bit more advanced of a certification. So that would be also something that's very important.
Thanks, Evan. So at this point, that takes us to the end of the main presentation here. We do have some time for questions, so I'll go through those. Looks like...
Wait, Evan, if you don't mind, I just wanted to add, because there's a bunch of questions about it. I talked about straight line and pooled reserves. So there's two methods of funding or calculating how you're going to fund the reserve. All reserve analyses are based upon the estimated remaining useful life of the actual component and the cost anticipated at the time of replacement or repair. In a pooled reserve, all of the funds, so you have all your different components. You have your painting, your roofing, your railings, your elevators, your seawalls, or any of the items that would be in the component schedule. In a pooled reserve, you would calculate the amounts that would be necessary to fund so that you have enough money at the end when that expense is anticipated. But all of the pooled funds are available for use for any of the items in the component, in the pooled component. So it's called cash flow or pooled funding, and it's a lot more flexible than straight line funding. Straight line funding would be if you have a roof reserve, whatever money you put into roof is dedicated to the roof and forever it will stay. And whatever money you dedicate to painting is the same, elevators the same. So you don't have that flexibility to be able to consider the entire pool when calculating how much to collect. And one of the questions was about the Florida Bar Report. The Florida Bar Report suggests that life safety structural items remain in a straight line pool so that they're not confused with any of the funds that would be available for maybe some items that are not considered as important to the structural of the life site.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I know I want to piggyback off something Lisa said earlier. You know, if you read that whole Miami Herald article, you will find that obviously Champlain Towers was an anomaly, and it was really a perfect storm of multiple issues that added up to such a tragic event. So again, it's certainly you know, very, very, very rare occurrence, but it is important to understand how it happened and, you know, and know what you need to look for in your own building. So again, getting back into some of these questions. So I see Lisa and Evan have already answered a lot of questions.
Yeah, I'm hitting a bunch of them as we go through, so hopefully it minimizes a lot of it.
Right. So those of you who, if you hit the Q&A button, the middle button says answered. So 17 questions people have already had typewritten answers. So you can look in there for answers to questions that have already been asked. And we'll try to take a few of these live. There are some questions about repercussions for government officials, board members, different entities. Can they be held personally liable? Lisa, I think the short answer is no, although who knows what might happen with legislation. But at the current time, there really is no individual liability for these issues, correct?
Well, we really don't want to encourage individual liability. I mean, the vast majority of people that volunteer to serve on their boards are really just trying to do the right thing. And doing the right thing often depends on having the information you need to make those hard decisions. But as you know, I mean, you're pulled in many different directions when you serve on your board. You have the expertise of the professionals that you hire. You have the expertise of the management team. If you're working with a management team, you have the desires of the owners, and you're pulled in all those different directions. So really, the goal should be to give those board members, those volunteer leaders, the tools that they need to make the right decisions, not to penalize them for making a mistake. And of course, if somebody engages in wrongdoing, fraud or some kind of bad behavior, in those cases, that you do have the opportunity for personal liability. But we don't want to get to a point where people are afraid to volunteer for their boards because they're afraid that they're going to be held to some standard that's unattainable.
Right, and that'll make the problem worse because then there'll be no leadership to actually fix these things that need to be fixed. So. Can a condo board decide to defer full funding reserves without the owner's vote to do so? No, you have to have, the statute is very clear about how you waive full funding of reserves. Are reserve studies required now every 3 years? They are not. Reserve studies are not currently required by law. The Broward recommendations, as we discussed, are for, again, threshold buildings. Those are over 3 stories or more, 50 feet or taller. We will provide all of the slides in a follow-up email to the presentation. We talked about line item versus pooled reserves already. I'm not sure I understand that question. Does Broward County define what constitutes adequate insurance? I didn't see that in the memo that I read, but in general, Lisa, do you want to kind of get into briefly what is adequate insurance for a condo?
So the Condo Act says that the board is obligated to obtain and maintain adequate insurance. Now, adequate insurance is defined in the statute as replacement cost value, but insurance is a very fungible commodity. I mean, some associations are finding that after being insured for 15, 20 years with the same carrier, they're no longer even being offered the coverage. So the Broward County would, well, its recommendation would be to eliminate the use of best efforts to obtain adequate insurance and require adequate insurance to be based upon the replacement cost value of the components. And right now, that law already requires that an insurance appraisal be done every 36 months, which is maybe what people are confusing for the reserve study. But insurance is basically just market based. I mean, you need to, just like you need to do your homework before you choose an engineering professional, you need to have confidence in your insurance advisor that they are providing you with all of the options that are available at any particular time and explaining to you the benefits and the detriments of each coverage. But horribly, more often than not lately, it's a matter of what you can get, or if you can get it, not, you're not choosing between all the different luxuries of various coverages.
Okay, so we have a licensed manager who asks, how do you inspect the piers below grade? Evan, do you want to take a shot at that?
That is the new question. So, and that's probably what the biggest guidance thing that we're going to probably be taken away from that. So, when buildings are built, in most high rises, they have something called a piling foundation. So you're going to have basically these long square or circular pilings that are basically pound or drilled into bedrock, and that all gets monitored by a testing lab at the time of construction to confirm that it has the right bearing capacity. And that's done because you can't see it after you pass that phase of work. And the general idea or rule is that you really don't have problems with piling foundations. That's why they're really not something that you look at, after the building's built. And that might change. The technology is a lot of sonar technology, and basically what you can do is get some sort of idea how that piling is interacting with its foundation, and that I don't even know what the expense of that is, because it's not something that's really done. So what have some associations have done post, Surfside and this initial, trying to get all of our peace of mind and everything else, is basically open up some locations, basically dig out the tops of the piling caps and looking at the pilings to see if that connection still is there and looks appropriate. But what you can really tell from that's kind of an unknown at this point in time, and that's something that we're certainly going to need more guidance from in terms of that.
Thanks, Evan. A couple of people asked for you to repeat, was it a book or a website you recommended to look at before hiring an engineer?
Oh, I was kind of saying that maybe a little bit more in jest, but it was an International Concrete Repair Institute. They have a technical guideline for non-destructive evaluation, and that can kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what engineers are doing at the time. You have to pay for it, so it's not something I can just give away. So you need to go through their website and look it up.
Okay. Someone asked, could you give us a little more clarification on when you would just do a visual inspection, and then at what point would you recommend destructive testing?
Yeah, I think you need to rely on your engineer in order to give you that feedback. And I'll just say from some examples that we're working on. So for me, we started a building that is a post-tension building. So that's just a different type of reinforcing than a normal conventional reinforced building. And that type of reinforcement, it's cables that are stretched the length of your building and under very high tension. And in a lot of construction down here, those cables are anchored at the ends of the balcony slabs. So if we went and did a visual inspection of the building and we saw that there was a bunch of slab damage at the edges of the balconies, through our visual inspection and our acoustic emission inspection, we're then going to want to do some destructive testing at the edges of the balconies to observe the conditions of the anchors in specific locations to try to extrapolate exactly what we're looking at and exactly what type of repairs that we think we're going to do. So that would be an instance where I would want to do some more destructive testing. If, as an engineer, if you walk into a building and you see specific crack patterns that would be indicative of a flexural problem in a beam or a slab, and you saw, vertical cracking, and then it kind of got worse at the center span of that, you might want to then do some destructive testing to check the compressive strength of the concrete, or do some GPR to figure out exactly what size rebar and stuff's in there, so that way you can know if it was actually under designed, built appropriately, or maybe there was some increased loading there, and that can give you some feedback on how to properly strengthen the member. So it's not just a cure-all. You really need to have an engineer that knows what he's talking about, so that when they see something, then it can kind of lead to this, the little hamster turning up there and moving over to something else and saying, okay, I need to look a little bit better at this to be able to figure out what exactly the repair is. And I will tell you this, our industry and down here was already, there's more work than there are engineers down here. And I can't search 40-year recertification now on Google without having the optimized search come up well before I'm just trying to find what the actual certification paperwork is. So, there's a lot more to sift through now as a condo owner. So you really need to rely on your management company, other buildings that have gone through this. If you're on Gulf Ocean Mile, there's 10 buildings right now, all having work done right next to each other. So that would certainly be a pretty good feedback loop for you. And then there's, up in Jupiter, all the buildings now are approaching the age where they need to start doing work, and they're all getting work done simultaneously. So there's a lot of maybe talking to your neighbor and doing some old fashioned word of mouth and things like that now too, that you need to do in order to make a good decision.
Someone asked if you have an HOA and it's 1- and 2-story buildings, will proposed legislation cover? All the proposed legislation we're seeing, again, covers buildings 3 stories or more, 50 feet or taller. And
we'll piggyback on that, though. Some of the worst damage we've ever seen to concrete slabs has been on 2-story HOAs that were post-tension buildings, and the screen enclosures rotted out the cables and their entire floor slabs had to be removed. So it is something that you might not fall underneath this umbrella of getting your building recertified, but if you see cracks or spalling, you need to get a professional to look at it.
Great point. Someone mentions the Broward report requests increased hours for managers in specific areas. Yes, similar to the increased certification hours for board members related to building maintenance, there is a recommendation to increase the number of hours required for CAMs to get relicensed every 2 years, and part of that will be building maintenance and life safety. So yes, that's also being discussed in the at the legislature. A bunch of people again are asking, can we watch this at a later time? Yes, it'll be posted to YouTube, and it'll be on the Campbell website. There are a bunch of questions about reserves here. If you are interested in reserves, on the Campbell website, there are past webinars, and we do cover reserves in depth on a few of those, so that may help you. These are some specific questions about people's specific condos. Can't really answer those. Let's see. So a bunch of people are asking about life safety issues. So Evan, what are the components of the building that you would identify specifically as life safety versus other?
Yeah, so a typical building, high-rise balconies, the typical issues you would find would be on the exposed surfaces. That's typically the balcony surfaces. In concrete, the typical mechanism is corrosion, and that causes concrete spalling. So, your typical life safety, determination for concrete spalling is going to be, does this spall have capacity to worsen and potentially break away from the building and cause injury or death to a person? That's what you would typically see. If you get to cases where the balconies are so bad that you need to think about replacing them complete, then you need to install shoring and limit, access to the balconies. And that's about like the worst case scenario that we would typically see. So that's for a typical life safety, situation. Is that the other one would be railings. That's a major thing for buildings. If your existing railings are in poor condition, then that's, in our minds, a major life safety issue. So those would be the two typical things.
Okay. Let's see. Is there anything else here? Someone asked, what are the benefits to treating spalling early versus waiting for, until the 30 or 40-year mark?
The benefit is how much money you spend. Everything is always time value of money. Okay. And if you start properly maintaining your waterproof coatings, maintaining your sealants at a very early age, then I wish I could show up a chart, but your kind of limit the amount of corrosion. So instead of having this exponential growth, you kind of have a more gradual growth, and you don't need to make repairs as much. If you just wait and you haven't done anything, you know, that's when you get into the major repairs that, you know, can affect interiors of units or taking down slabs complete. You know, that's the waiting mechanism, and that's not a good way to go about it. You know, the good way to go about it is to do it every, you know, do a major project every 7 to 10 years. And if you have to do something minor in between, then do that. You know, that's going to get you on a good schedule and on, you know, on a good, you know, predictable amount of repair for the building's age.
The last question we'll take here. Someone asks, when you have a construction site on the lot next door to your building, when do you recommend hiring an engineer to monitor your building if there's an adjacent project?
Yeah, primarily that's done during the foundation construction. And a lot of times it's usually like pre-negotiated with the developer. The neighbors they're going to hire an engineer to do the monitoring for them. You could also hire your own engineer to do the monitoring of the monitor. So there's a lot of oversight you can have for that. And it's typically not an issue. And I know if you guys have read what lawsuits and stuff are out there for the development next door, you know, that's one of the things we need to wait and see, you know, if that exacerbated any conditions, but potentially not, or probably not.
Okay, well, we've hit 1 o'clock, so you want to be respectful of everybody's time. Lisa, any parting words here this afternoon?
I think one of the most important things that we discussed here today is how important it is for community leaders to have the tools that they need to understand their responsibilities. So if you're new to your board, or you're a CAM that's just taking over control of a new association, having those initial inventories of all of the components for which the association bears responsibility, I think is really important. Taking out all the contracts, figuring out what work is being done on a routine basis, consulting with the people that you feel comfortable with in order to determine whether your building's needs are being addressed on an ongoing basis. Because I read this study, it came out from Stanford University, that said a failure to, just like Benjamin, a failure to plan is a plan to fail. But the point being that delay or failing to attend to maintenance needs on an ongoing basis can increase your cost by tenfold. So putting off today what can be done tomorrow is just going to increase your cost, and what during the period of time that you're putting off the inevitable, you're living in a less safe, possibly a less safe structure. So get it done early and often, right?
Right. Yeah. And with this, we're still in a low interest rate environment, even though we're experiencing some high inflation. So money is still cheap, and there are a lot of banks that will lend on these type of projects. So waiting is probably going to cost you a lot more just in terms of sheer dollars in the long run than doing something sooner rather than later right now as well. So, know that there is financing opportunities out there for boards that are facing a $5, $10, $15 million price tag possibly to fix some of these issues. So do reach out to your management company. We can certainly help you with that. Evan, any other parting words before we sign off today?
No, well, maybe a little. I think a lot of this is trying to give everybody peace of mind, and Lisa mentioned that this wasn't an anomaly, and this is not the norm, and it's not going to be the norm. And if you've hired good people, there's a lot of good people in our industry. If you've hired a good person, they've done a competent inspection, there's no reason to worry. And I think that's the main takeaway here.
Thanks, Evan. So appreciate everybody who signed on with us today. If you have any questions for any of us, our contact information is here. Please do not hesitate to reach out. We do try to answer any questions. Again, all the materials will be sent to you afterwards. If you could fill out the poll that just popped up on your screen, it's a great help to us to make sure that these webinars are informative and continue to get better. And do sign up for our newsletter and through our blog, readfan.org, and you will get all of the updates on new seminars. So we thank you all again and look forward to seeing you in the future. Have a nice afternoon.